Without objection.
Madam President, I am in a moment going to ask unanimous consent that we proceed to confirm a nominee. Stephanie Sullivan, who's been nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to the African Union, she was nominated June 15th of 2022, a position now vacant since January of this year. Let me briefly say why this is important. The African Union is the entity most likely to successfully negotiate peace in Sudan, a country now roiled by domestic violence, by a war between one faction of its military and another, and thousands of Americans are at risk. I think it's crucially important to fill all of our vacant ambassadorial positions, but this one is particularly critical because of the role the AU can and should play in resolving this conflict, but we lack an ambassador in this vital continent-wide organization. I will go on at some greater length about the qualifications, the background of this talented career Foreign Service officer who's been an ambassador twice before in Africa, but I'll also say that statements that she has made in her role as an ambassador reflect the policy of the administration at the time, not her personal preferences or values. She is a talented representative of the United States as a diplomat whose actions and statements reflect the administrations she has served. With that, I ask unanimous consent, as if in executive session, that the Senate consider nomination calendar number 68, Stephanie Sanders Sullivan, to be representative of the United States to the African Union, and that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motion be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. Reserving the right to object, I want to talk about a few things here and why I'm objecting to this nomination and why I would not vote for it if and when it comes before the full Senate. So first is a question of competence. This is an ambassador, Ambassador Sullivan, who went to Ghana and said on local television that she was proud of the fact that she had failed her Foreign Service exam twice. It's hard to imagine a Chinese leader going to a country where they were trying to develop diplomatic relationships and bragging about failing any type of Foreign Service exam. And I don't know where this idea that we should celebrate failing the Foreign Service exam amongst our diplomatic corps comes from, but it doesn't make us look good and it doesn't help Ambassador Sullivan in her duties. Now, a second problem. The last time that we sent Ambassador Sullivan to a senior job in Africa, her successor spent the following couple of months apologizing for and cleaning up for the job that she had did. In particular, she did so much to push a very, very divisive set of ideas in an American political context on a foreign country that had nothing to do with our national interest. In particular, she seems particularly fond of the most left-wing versions of transgender ideology. Now, let me just address this particular issue. I have my views on the transgender ideology question. In particular, I really worry that we are going too far, too fast, not in support of the evidence, prescribing treatments and surgeries and hormonal therapies that could damage children for years. I think we need to be patient with this, and we need to follow the science. This is why, by the way, most of our European allies, Sweden, for example, a country hailed as a great example of good health care 10 years ago by many Democrats in this chamber, is going the opposite direction of where we're going on the transgender ideology question. Now, that said, I can accept that many people disagree with me, but that disagreement in an American political context has no place for the diplomatic corps of our country. We should not be taking something that a majority of Americans disagree and try to force it down the throat of another country. And the fact that we engage in this cultural imperialism is one of the biggest threats to American national security in the world today. Now, let's talk about this cultural imperialism, the fact that it's unsupported and the fact that it's not good for our country. We haven't had a real debate in this body. We have not had a sufficient conversation about whether we want to support certain ideological preferences in our diplomatic corps. Why, for example, do we have a liberal white woman going to Africa and telling them that they're not civilized enough when it comes to issues of transgender ideology? Why do we have a diplomatic corps that is taking a hotly contested issue in an American political context and demanding that African nations follow the lead of the far left instead of doing what they think that they should do? Now, there are going to be people who say that there are all manner of atrocities that happen in Africa when it comes to sexual issues, when it comes to gender minorities and so forth. And of course, we think that's terrible. We don't want that to happen. But she's gone so much further than that in placing a very particular set of ideas at the forefront of our diplomacy. And let me just leave us with leave this body with one final thought, Madam President. Look at the demographics of the people who have fought and died in American wars over the last generation. Many Democrats, of course, have done so, and we honor their service and we honor the sacrifice of themselves and their families, but a disproportionate share, especially of the enlisted troops who are at the forefront of American power, the threat of military action, and sometimes the reality of military action, is what gives the State Department so much power in the first place. The knowledge that if you don't follow America's lead, you can sometimes have military and security consequences because of it. Do we think that the thousands of Americans who have died in America's wars in the last 20 or so years died so that the trans flag would fly over the nation of Ghana or any other African nation? And why is it the policy of this government, again, to take a controversial topic in the context of an American political debate and force it down the throats of somebody else? This is damaging our national security. Larry Summers, an Obama administration economist, a guy well respected on the left side of the aisle, said, talking to some of his friends who work in development in Africa, that when the Chinese come, they bring, let me get the exact quote here because I don't want to mess it up. What we get from China is an airport. What we get from the United States is a lecture, and that's Larry Summers quoting somebody who does economic development in troubled regions of the world. Why?
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Can I finish the point, Chris? And then
Certainly,
go ahead,
please.
Senator Coons. Sorry. Here's what I would say here. The final point that I'll make is we have built a foreign policy of hectoring and moralizing and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding poor people, and I think that we should pursue a foreign policy, a diplomacy of respect, and a foreign policy that is not rooted in moralizing. It's rooted in the national interest of this country. Because Ambassador Sullivan is at the lead of moralizing instead of pursuing America's national interest, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
The senator from Delaware.
at apparently another time, I look forward to having the opportunity to hearing some substantiation of the wild charges just made by my colleague from Ohio. I did as much research as I could before appearing in what I had understood mistakenly to be the foundation of his objection. Now I look forward to figuring out how this nominee to serve again as an ambassador is an advocate of far-left gender therapies of some kind. Let me make two simple points, if I can, in response to the comments I just heard on the floor. As someone who chairs the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that funds our development efforts around the world, and particularly in Africa, and as someone who was just in 5 different countries across the continent, to characterize China's engagement with Africa as one that promotes development in a positive way, that is respectful and uplifting, and our engagement as simply hectoring, badly misses decades of the United States being the #1 supporter of public health across the continent. We are just now celebrating the 20th anniversary of President Bush's signature initiative, PEPFAR, which has saved 25 million lives. The Chinese do not invest in public health in anything like the scale and scope the United States does. The Chinese, it's true, don't ask questions about suppression of minorities, about mistreatment of journalists, about the closing of political space, about domestic repression, and the United States does. And so if that's to be characterized as hectoring, then I would be glad to stand up for hectoring. We do challenge autocrats across the continent of Africa, and we do stand up for democracy. We also invest significantly in human development at a time when China invests principally in airports and soccer stadiums and highways. So I would be happy to have a debate anytime that my colleague from Ohio chooses to stay long enough to have the discussion about the foundations of our engagement in the developing world. I also, frankly, take exception to his characterization of a talented, long-serving member of the Foreign Service who represented us as a confirmed ambassador in both Ghana and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Let me make the core point I intended to make earlier, but in order to accommodate my colleague's need to go be interviewed on television, I cut my comments short. In Sudan today, a newly emerged war is raging between two militaries. Thousands of people are at risk. In particular, Americans are at risk. And it is the African Union, a continent-wide organization headquartered in Addis, in Ethiopia's capital, that could and should be the entity that leads to peace in Sudan. To not have a confirmed ambassador is to weaken our ability to engage with the AU and to engage with the leaders of these two military factions in Sudan. For too much of the 2 years of the Biden administration, we have struggled to get confirmations here on the floor of the Senate of talented nominees. We have worked closely together to make sure that we've overcome some of the holds and some of the blocks to nominees in the past, and I am disappointed and frustrated by the spurious arguments made by my colleague as to why he is standing in the way of this particularly capable, seasoned, and experienced member of our Foreign Service. I had imagined, based on previous statements made by my colleague, that he might be objecting to something she said on the occasion of George Floyd's murder. And I came to the floor today with significant detailed content from the previous administration, making it clear that she wasn't acting simply on her own, that she wasn't acting on some leftist agenda, that she was acting in response to direction from both the Africa Bureau and the Deputy Secretary of State. I had thought he might also be referencing a posting that was made on the occasion of a pride event, of an LGBTQ pride event, something that happens in embassies all over the world and that reflects a shared commitment by the American people to human rights that is understandably part of diversity and inclusion. My hunch is that I'll have to wait for another time for my colleague to prioritize debate on the floor of the Senate over making his way to a cable television hit, but I respect my colleague. He is someone who has written a very compelling book, who's been elected by the people of Ohio, and who I expect to have the opportunity to get to know. We have only served together now for several months, and today was literally the first time we have exchanged words. So I hope there will be more reason and more substance to his opposition to this nominee than what I heard on the floor tonight, and I look forward to engaging with him in that discussion and that debate. With that, Madam President, my remarks on this particular topic, and once handed the closing remarks, we'll speak briefly and then close the floor. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, which I think is now, that it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Thursday, April 20th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Following the conclusion of morning business, the Senate resumed consideration of calendar number 28, Senate Bill 870.
Without objection, so ordered.
For the information of the Senate, there will be 2 roll call votes at 11:15 and 1 at 1:45 p.m. tomorrow. If there is no further business to come before the Senate at this time, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.